from network providers like Verizon and AT&T to technology companies like Microsoft, Cisco, to content providers like NBC Universal, Viacom, and then artists like the Songwriters of America and a broader coalition that represents all of those different communities. Those are groups that sometimes have been meeting in courtrooms more often than they have around a common table to discuss issues. But the idea of this fairly unique alliance is to try to create opportunities, a very critical moment in telecommunications policy, for a new kind of dialogue around how the American consumer can access all the wonderful and amazing content that is available on the internet, and what kind of internet and what kind of culture of the internet will make available that content in a way that provides a satisfactory experience for the consumers. We've got interest in this debate, as you can well imagine, and you can tell from that list of companies. But I'll just tell you what our common set of principles are around a thing that we feel defines what should be a digital society, a place in which people can safely use the internet, get the kind of content they want, have the kind of experiences as a consumer that are satisfactory. And we built this around three principles that I will just simply read so you kind of know where we're coming from. Every citizen should have access to affordable broadband service. The more people that participate in the digital society, the stronger and more cohesive it will be. Consumers are entitled to fast, safe, reliable access to the legal products, content, services, and websites of their choice. In turn, those who produce goods, services, and creative content deserve the chance to earn fair compensation for their efforts. Networks need to be robust, intelligent, and well-managed to support the full range of online activities and to deliver content safely and reliably. Well-meaning principles, and you can easily understand if you unpack some of those, they're pretty significant technology and telecommunications policy issues that underscore that. But that strikes me that what this day is about should be a debate about what those policies really look like and what the internet of the future really needs to be. We are at a critical moment because of the FCC's rulemaking process that I think most of you are probably familiar with. And I have been involved in these issues, been part of the net neutrality fight now for several years, bear several scars to prove that. But I hope that this is a moment when the sloganeering that very often characterizes these debates will end, and we will have the kind of debate and the kind of conversation that I hope these panelists will have today. We tried to, frankly, be an honest broker here for a discussion among people who really know the internet well, in fact, some of who actually could reasonably be said to have helped create it. And it is those voices that I think the political folks like Mark McKinnon and I need to listen to now. We need to have a serious conversation about what kind of internet we will have in the future. Is it going to be sophisticated? Is it going to be reasonably managed? If so, what does that mean? What does it mean to manage services on the internet? You know, what are the boundaries of what discrimination on the internet looks like, really looks like, when you talk about the way the internet actually works? And I think those are the issues that we really wanted to bring to the table today and discuss. So we look forward to this debate, and we just thank all of you for participating. And my role is to actually introduce someone who's very familiar with the kinds of debates we've had in this town around technology policy for a long time. Richard Wiley is someone I think most of you know, someone with great experience in adjudicating disputes between parties in conflict, a former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from 1970 to 1977. Some call him, I guess, the father of high-definition television because of the work that he's done in the years since that he was FCC chairman. He was the chair of the Advisory Committee on Advanced Television Service for the FCC. But I think most people know him now as one of the really thoughtful people in telecommunications policy, an advocate for people that are represented by his very successful firm, Wiley, Ryan, and Dick. It's just a great pleasure to introduce you and to thank you for helping guide our conversation today. He'll be moderating both of our panels. We're going to leave time for all of you to have questions, and we look forward to a very vibrant conversation today. Thank you all for coming. Take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thank you. And welcome, everybody. I want to thank Mike and John Henke for putting this wonderful program together and inviting me to serve as your moderator for today. Basically, we have two, I think, sterling panel discussions, future networks, if I can say basically, and network management. And in both cases, our format is going to be, we're going to ask each of our panelists, who are experts in the field, to give us just a few minutes opening statement to basically express their take on the issues that we're going to be covering. And then I'm going to come along to ask some questions, followed up by your own questions. A couple of rules of the road is I'm obviously a practicing communications lawyer, as Mike said. I'm not a cipher. I have my own views, but this is neither the time or place to express them. I'm not going to put my thumb on the scale. I'm going to be equally unfair to all of the panelists if I can, and I hope you will take the same posture. When you ask questions, I wish you would stand and identify yourself, and let's have a good dialogue here. I'll start out with questions. If you want to intersperse your own while we go along, that's fine. But let's stay with the question or the subject matter we're dealing with, and we'll move on to a different subject, and you can come back in. And at the end, if we've got some more time, you can take it and go with it. So let me just introduce, if I can, just briefly, our first panel. Again, Networks for the Future. By some estimates, maybe 200 million people in the United States today rely on the internet. The vast majority of it make use for broadband connection to send emails, browse the internet, make phone calls, engage in e-commerce. However, over the last few years, as you well know, broadband and bandwidth-intensive applications such as streaming video and peer-to-peer file sharing have really exploded in popularity. And these applications have dramatically increased the volume of internet traffic, both upstream and downstream, and have begun to place unprecedented demands on the capacity of current broadband networks. Now, the broadband service providers have responded, by some estimates, investing some $120 billion in modern communications infrastructure. But despite this investment, and despite the tremendous growth that we're seeing in broadband development today, there has been concern expressed in some quarters that current broadband services are too slow and too expensive, especially compared to other countries. Moreover, some people suggest that competition in the broadband market is lacking. Consumers should have more choice in broadband providers. At the same time, however, I think we have to note that a significant percentage of U.S. Consumers who have access to broadband have simply not opted to employ it. So it seems to me that the key questions we might want to talk about today in broad strokes are, would more of these consumers subscribe if faster broadband speeds were more readily available? But where will investment come to deploy the next generation of broadband networks? And is it realistic to expect that we're going to see multiple providers deploying such networks? To help us, chart these difficult waters, we've got a very interesting cast on hand. I think they have diverse backgrounds and diverse views. One of them is not going to be here for maybe 20 minutes, coming from the airport. His plane is late, so we'll introduce him now and hope he'll just join in as we go. So let me start on my left, if I can, with Robert Curtis, who is Director of Network Deployment at the FCC, and who has been actively involved in the whole broadband and network neutrality issues. Before joining the commission, he spent 5 years at McKinsey in high-tech activities, and he also tells me he's actually a lawyer, so naughty on that. On my left is Christopher Yu, many of you know, is professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, also at the Annenberg School. He's a leading authority, I think it's fair to say, by everybody's estimates on law and technology, and has been heavily involved in the network neutrality debate before Congress, the FCC, and the FTC. On my immediate right is Derek Turner, who is research director at Free Press, and he also has written extensively on a wide range of media and technology issues, and that research has been featured in such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And then Brett Swanson will be along, as I say, in maybe 15, 20 minutes. Brett is president of Entropy Economics, a research firm focused on technology and global economy. He's also been a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and he was formerly a senior fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. So I wanted to get his introduction out of the way so we can just slot him in when he gets here. But let's start out, Mr. Curtis, if I can, with the first question for you, and that is, I understand that your team at the FCC is calculating the most cost-efficient and effective way of deploying broadband in unserved areas. How are these calculations being made, if you can tell us that, and how do you expect this information to be utilized?
Yeah, sure. We're
And by the way, I'm just going to say, I'll put a question to each of these panelists. Hope that others will join in as they care to. Go ahead.
we're building an economic model by major technology group that on scope and scale has probably not been seen since the benchmark cost proxy model. We've got, you know, in the double digits of folks working on this. You know, the guy who's driving, for instance, the wireless piece holds 60 patents in OFDM wireless. He was the lead design engineer for Flare and Qualcomm. That's the kind of folks that we have looking at the technology. We're building a massive data set from every piece of publicly available information on both availability, who gets what speed and where are they by technology, and also by infrastructure. So every piece of data that's available publicly and that we've been able to get through filings on where's fiber, where are cable nodes, where are RTs, where are COs, which COs are fiber fed, where are wireless towers, which wireless towers have 2G versus 3G, what's the frequency being used, what do we expect the propagation ratios to be, radius to be. That's all going to be put in and is being put now, in a large model, and from that, we're going to be able to run a bunch of different scenarios against, and we're doing this, by the way, I should say, at the census block level, so as granular as we can get. And, you know, I think we're going to come up with a aggregate, at the aggregate level, a statistically valid way of saying who's got what, and have a pretty good point of view on what needs to go where and at what cost.
All right, Mr. Turner, as you see it, and as you've heard what has just been said, what do you think the most significant challenges are to deploying broadband in unserved areas, and what do you think the government ought to do to address those challenges?
Well, obviously the most significant challenge facing deployment in unserved areas is the lack of density and the extremely high fixed cost to deploying to a single customer. I mean, whereas, you know, Verizon today, when they're passing a home with their fiber product, it may be, you know, $800 for the pass and another $700 for the installation. In a rural area, just even building, you know, a wireless solution can run multiple thousands of dollars per household. But where we can start to tackle that issue is, I think, fundamentally rethinking our approach to universal service, and particularly the Universal Service Fund. I think that's a huge pot of money that a lot of it may be fairly or unfairly characterized as being misused or wasted. And I think that, you know, it's long past time that we get together and try to figure out a way to transition that fund from being a strict, you know, telephony-only fund to a fund that thinks more about paying the upfront cost of infrastructure in order to have triple play services that operators can then be self-sustaining and self-sufficient and earn enough return to maintain their own operating costs and not need further public subsidies.
Professor Yu, Finland recently announced that it was making 1 megabit broadband connection a legal right, and France has also declared internet access as a basic human right. What's your view about these approaches, and should the United States follow a similar pattern?
Well, you're starting to see a lot of human rights approaches to a whole bunch of different aspects, and I think that a lot of people are starting to back away from those notions. It's not something that we've traditionally done as a society. I think Derek's absolutely right. There's some real challenges based on the density of consumers, especially with wireline technologies. You know, I love, there's a famous quote, I can't remember where it comes from, is that Moore's Law does not apply to digging ditches. I mean, you know, there's a lot of things that we can do, but there's just some, in terms of laying new physical infrastructure, there's some irreducible costs that we can't leverage in the traditional ways. What's interesting to me is the creative ways that people are solving the build-out problem, to me, is captured very nicely by the contrast between Fios and UVerse. Fios is laying, you know, 100 megabits plus to the home at the cost of $24 billion. AT&T's UVerse is leveraging the existing infrastructure at a cost of $6 to $7 billion. And the capital needs are much, in a world in which capital becomes dearer and dearer to come by, this becomes a very, very interesting business proposition on both of these. Some people have said Verizon is visionary, and everyone else is being short-sighted because we're going to need that bandwidth. What Verizon will itself tell you is that investment has been weighing on its cost of capital since the day it made it. The bond ratings were downgraded for Verizon. It's been weighing on every project they've done. Their stock price has gone down. And in essence, they've made the kind of bet that companies make, which is they have made investment, and they're seeing if it pays out, and they've hit every number. Wall Street has become increasingly friendly to them. They've hit every number that they've had, but there's still great uncertainty over what's going to happen in the future. What's the difference? Prioritization. UVerse doesn't have the bandwidth. So what do? Is they prioritize AT&T prioritizes its video offering above everyone else's. And that becomes their solution to get into more homes in a lower cost way. And what that means is they have to maintain less bandwidth and less headroom to maintain the same quality of service, which has direct implications for the digital divide and build out. Because if you have to build more bandwidth to provision a neighborhood, you're going to have more subscribers to pay it out, to break it even. And if you do that, it's going to lower the number of places we can build out. And so we don't know who's got the better model. And in fact, and frankly, if any of us knew now, we wouldn't be sitting here. We would have money in the market and we'd be clipping coupons on the beach. This is the nature of economic risk, and it's very hard to predict. The other wild card is the other major platform is wireless. And as Derek says, it's extremely expensive. We've gone from a world where we're reconditioning existing architectures in the terms of hundreds of dollars per customer, and now talking about in the thousands. Wireless has a whole bunch of other problems that others don't, other technologies don't. Significant problems with local congestion that traditional telephone-based technologies don't. Big problems even that surpass what cable does because of the nature of wireless propagation. All of you who know Shannon's law, there's a real wireless goes in all 360 degrees in all directions and has an interference level. There's a density problem that just doesn't exist with other technologies. It's not susceptible to the same congestion management techniques that have run the rest of the internet. And what we're seeing is the network is dealing with this in very, very creative ways. Engineers are debating actively about the proper way to solve these problems. And so what we're going to see is we're seeing a lot of creativity about how to reach these places. Would I call this a right? I think that this U.S. as a society, we confronted this in Goldberg versus Kelly a long time ago and sort of flinched. It's not our inclination to do these sorts of things. And my reaction is we didn't say employment or housing is a natural human right. As important as I think broadband is, in the grand scheme of things, if I was to put it up, I wouldn't put it at that level. But I do think that there is a deep interaction between our ability to provide broadband to a larger number of customers and a larger number of geographies and the flexibility with which we permit network providers in satisfying those needs.
Yeah, I actually do.
I was just going to say, I want to welcome Mr. Swanson. I have already introduced you. I'm sorry your plane was late, but we're glad to have you.
Thank you
Go
very
ahead,
much.
Mr. Turner.
Yeah, I think Professor Yu is exactly right. It's probably maybe reason Finland is speaking of this as a human right. I think it's just a manifestation of the recognition that it's a very important and critical technology. And I actually think our Communications Act serves as a great framework for this, to make available to all people of the United States, regardless of race, ethnicity, location, geography, a world-class communication service. And I think Section 254 and the embodiment of our universal service principles are there and are actually flexible enough to be expanded to broadband and to do it in a way that will eventually ensure that everyone has access to a basic level of high-speed internet access service.
But the interesting thing in the debate has been, if you'll forgive me to use a cliche, is the traditional divide between netheads and dullheads. I constantly see netheads say, oh, we should make this all Title II, and we should make it universal service. And I think those are great aspirations. Any of us who are familiar with the traditional telephone-based regulation, anyone who embraced universal service should run a chill down your spine. Because we're talking about access charge reform, we're talking about the direct subsidies, and some of the thorniest issues that we've ever confronted and that are as yet unresolved. And so it's easier to say than people. It's harder to do, and people who are experiencing this business recognize that. And I think the FCC recognizes it as well.
Mr. Swanson, I want to get you in on this. Do you think there's a minimum speed for broadband services that a customer needs to have to take full advantage of the internet. And I would follow that up by saying, what if all the customer wants to do is to send emails or to shop online? Does he really need 5, 10, or 50 megabits, shall we say?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the thing is that we have a great diversity of new applications, a great diversity of new access technologies. As the internet converges, as all these different media and different networks of the past converge onto one network, we see a proliferation of different kinds of content and access devices. And so I don't think that one definition makes sense across the board. I apologize for my own narrowband connection from Indianapolis this morning. But just an example from the other day, I bought my wife a new computer this summer, and I had just gotten around to backing up her files on a remote backup service the other day. And in just about 3 or 4 months, she'd accumulated 38 gigabytes of data on her new computer already. And I have a great cable modem connection at our house, 15 megabits per second down, 2 megabits per second up. And yet it still took about 4 days to back up this new computer at a 1.2 megabit per second upload speed, which is, pretty good. It's about as good as you can get in the residential arena. Some services, fiber services, are better. And yet it was fine. I backed up the computer. We went away for the weekend with the kids who were on fall break, and I came back and it was backed up. And for that service, backing up this computer, it was perfectly good speed for that particular application. Other applications, you're going to want a lot more speed. And so I think the diversity is fine. Obviously, speeds and robustness depend on how much we're willing to pay as consumers, how much providers and other people in an ecosystem are willing to invest. And I think the biggest thing with all of this is that we need flexibility in building our networks and how we finance our networks to match. We need flexibility in building our networks to match the flexibility and the dynamism of what's happening on the net itself.
Mr. Curtis, I know, go ahead. I know Mr. Curtis wanted to speak. And then
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Brett's pointed out a great example, probably one of the best examples of why diversified services matter, and much of the debate is, I think, off point. Backing up files is one of the low priority events, and this is what I think it's a mistake to talk about minimum bandwidth available. You can actually make do with fairly small bandwidth for things that don't have a great deal of time pressure, that you can load into the internet during the hours of the wee hours of the morning where the network is uncongested. This is why bandwidth caps are a mistake. Bandwidth caps look at your total volume over a 30-day period, but in the dead of, after midnight, when no one else is using the internet, that's the perfect time for low priority things to run in the background. So when we talk about minimum services, we're thinking about new things that reduce that pre-positioning video onto your hard drive, a la DVRs at night while you're not using the content, are ways that we can actually expand the use of the bandwidth in very creative ways that don't require us physically building out a new infrastructure. And we get some really interesting solutions. And the other problem that we've seen also from the universal service side is that when we define minimums, it is going to be a moving target. When we had universal service in telephones, then the next question is, does that include touch tone service? Does that include call waiting? And that becomes a constant redefinition. What we're seeing is a lot of creativity and ways to solve these problems that deal with fairly constrained minimums, either by streaming, buffering, caching, and prioritizing in ways that I think for a download service, prioritizing makes total sense just by assigning it to a lower priority and letting it run.
Robert Curtis?
Yeah, I mean, this is both a vexing problem, and I think it's absolutely fundamental, right? The Act asks the Commission to provide a plan to universalize broadband, and it doesn't define the word. So to universalize something, it seems like we kind of need to know what it is that we're universalizing. And I think, there are a lot of people on the broadband plan team spending a lot of time thinking about this. But, it does strike me that it's inherently a more complicated problem than telephony. Telephony is fundamentally two-dimensional. Broadband is at least three-dimensional, perhaps four, depending on how you think about it. Also think, I agree, there's been more focus on download than, is probably warranted. There are latency problems, jitter problems. The uplink problem is a big problem. It depends on what you think about whether you're going to have telemedicine. It depends on whether you think there's going to be telecommuting at home, and there's going to be more intensive high-definition video conferencing that you do. There's also availability problems. The way you capacity, size, and plan a data network is many orders of magnitude more complicated than the way you do the same thing on a telephony network. And these are all components that are necessary to think about and resolve before you, come to a point of view on what broadband is. And I guess I should close by saying on this, I think, a good way of thinking about it, perhaps not the only way, is to think about this like you would the consumer price index. Instead of thinking about a basket of goods, you think about a basket of applications. And that basket of applications has to evolve over time. And you may want to come up with segments of different kinds of customers that use different applications. But at the end of the day, broadband is probably supposed to drive an experience and add value and create or enable services. And so it's pretty important to focus on what the critical services are today, and more importantly, to the evolutionary point, where we think those applications and services are going to go.
Mr. Turner, in many areas of the country today, customers have the option to purchase broadband at services at speeds of maybe 25 to 100 megabits. But we know that many are not doing so. Do you think that's a matter of price, or do you think it's a possibility that some customers just don't see the need to have such faster speed, or maybe both?
Well, look, it's a bit of the chicken or the egg. Yes, some of the very high-speed tiers are now being made available, but essentially you have to build it and then they come. The applications will eventually follow. Yes, the prices are very high initially, but that's actually probably a good thing for future deployment. You do want some form of price discrimination, because the people who are early adopters, who are willing to pay $129 a month for Comcast's 100 megabit service in Minneapolis, those are the people you want to be able to capture the value from those people when you first deploy these services. So I have the utmost confidence that eventually there will be more applications produced for these types of services, and adoption will eventually head in that direction, because essentially what drives the value of the network, what drives people being willing to pay a monthly service charge, is not the conduit itself, but it's not megabits, it's what they can do with those megabits. And I think that is what is eventually going to drive most of the cable providers who've been sitting on the sidelines and not deploying DOCSIS 3 technology to eventually jump in once they see some of these applications and demand increase for these higher-end services.
Mr. Swanson, but isn't it true that if customers don't see the need, at least right now, maybe eventually, for faster speeds, what's the financial incentive for broadband providers to spend the money to deploy networks that offer this kind of capacity that maybe the customers currently don't want?
Well, if customers don't want it and don't ante up, then sure there will be a problem. But most of these companies have already made some big bets, some very large commitments, or either have built out large portions of their fiber networks or have upgraded their cable plant, or in the middle of doing so. And so, as Derek said, it's they're making the bet that the customers will come, and if they don't, then that'll be a problem for the big network investors. And I think that's why it's so important to have flexibility in technology, in finance, in business models, is because this is not a sure thing. The internet, whether it's applications, whether it's data centers, whether it's networks, whether it's the trade-off between wired and wireless that are competing with each other, competition between cable and telco, all these competitions, the competition between your PC and the cloud, there are lots of things that are uncertain, and these are, across the board, this is a risky arena. And again, I come back to the point, that's why I think we need flexibility in technology and business model and in finance.
I think that implicit in Dick's question is a perspective that there's one perspective, which is the demand-led. The consumers will want it, and until they happen, we're not going to see the business model. There's a second model, which is if you build it, they will come, which is it's a supply-side driven model. Neither one is exactly right. What you need, I mean, think about Facebook. We didn't know we needed Facebook until it showed up. So we didn't have, this is something where an innovator went out there and created a demand for something. I always think about this. When I was about to have a kid, I walked into a baby store and found out there were all these products I didn't know I needed, and all of a sudden I needed. And it's just, there's this sort of experience. It's not demand-led, it's not supply-led. We're all looking for the next killer app for the internet. We all suspect it's going to be video. And the interesting question is, how do we create that kind of synergy? And one of the things I love about this particular forum is it brings the network providers and the content providers to try to come together on a business model to try to find a way to deliver products, not just waiting for the consumers to say, oh, now we want Hulu, or now we want to be able to stream all this stuff, but to try to find a way that maybe we can also get out ahead of consumers, create some things that they don't know about. But what strikes me is in all economic relationships, when you have a vertical chain of production, there's an aspect in which it's cooperative, there's an aspect in which it's adversarial. Cooperative, no one makes money unless we're selling product, not the content provider, not with the network provider. Then the adversarial part is how do you divide that up? To date, the adversarial part has overwhelmed the cooperative part to the point where we haven't monetized video. We haven't created the kind of services which consumers want and are willing to pay for. And we should make sure that we get to the extent to which incentives are aligned, we should make sure that we satisfy those as much as possible and to try to get that kind of dialogue going.
Do you think that a customer ought to have the option of buying the broadband service that meets his particular needs rather than being required to have a more vibrant service?
Absolutely. My mother-in-law is an email user. Having one class of service would simply require her to pay for the video upgrade for the whole block, and that doesn't make sense. What I think we need to do is be much more creative in terms of how we do those tiers. Some technologists talk about the ultimate class of service that is really, in many ways, the most valuable is what they call the scavenger class. That is, you find unused bandwidth when no one else is using it, and that's basically almost free because it's not being used. So and oddly enough, relegating a peer-to-peer downloader to scavenger class, assuming they can pre-order it, is actually a wonderful thing for the consumer, a wonderful thing for the network because it gets to use other capacity that would otherwise be unused to deliver value to the consumer, but is the kind of creativity that we haven't seen in terms of the way we've designed price classes. To think about it, and it is a form of prioritization, but if we can make it as options available to the consumer and be responsive to the concerns that Free Press has put on the table, the very strong was that the consumer is in control and can actually make a choice where someone like Brett needs to back up his wife's computer. He picks a low class of service and pays an appropriate amount.
Given that, Mr. Curtis, do you think there's a concern that advanced options will be preserved as we move toward the next generation of broadband networks and as perhaps customers become more sophisticated about the kinds of services that they might want if they knew about them and had them available?
Ask that one more time?
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is, if you could take the kind of demand model that the professor is saying, will we still preserve the opportunities to build a more advanced broadband network as customers become more sophisticated?
So I guess in a lot of ways the way I would ask that question is if we segment out and get more sophisticated about our segmentation and allow more efficient shopping, do we compete a lot of the profit out, right? Which cuts the long run incentives to invest.
Precisely.
Right. I think there's probably a significant geographic cut on that. When you look at the more high cost areas, I can't remember who was mentioning the differences and the dynamics of the rural areas, right? But you find that a lot of places are probably in a lot of ways underwater on a per line basis that exist even today. And as you try to go upstream, you've got to find a way to preserve a revenue stream that works. I think the thing that I worry about a little bit, and I don't have a firm conclusion on this, but the way I guess I would think about this problem is, the fixed to variable component of any of these telco networks is very high on the fixed side. The variable is actually quite low. So on a per customer basis, the cost of adding a scavenger customer is low. Right, but what you've really got to worry about is the fully loaded cost and how you recover your capital across all those subscribers. And if you found that a lot of people wanted the cheap scavenger model, I do think there's a significant chance that you erode enough profit, right? That you aren't going to have enough of the robust investment in the infrastructure that you want to make sure that you stay ahead. There's bound to be, depending on demand, depending on prices, depending on how many people want it, there's bound to be a way to optimize that pricing. Just don't know how far you can go without starting to do some damage on infrastructure investment.
My instincts are quite different. My reaction is to the extent to which providers remain free to offer as many classes of services as they want, that would allow, if it's going to erode their business model, they will be more conservative about adding more classes. To me, the fundamental instinct is there are books in places about how do retailers survive Walmart, and how do they come in? Low-cost producer, mega, able to go into smaller places. And the answer is boutiques survive in a Walmart world, by selling specialized goods to certain niches that value them particularly highly. You can actually create ways where by differentiating services, you can actually make it go. And we're starting to see even within department stores, the boutique within a department store model, all of a sudden you're opening up new ways to monetize things and to satisfy consumer demand. And I'm more hopeful.
I'm sure that the good business people and all the companies are thinking about ways of differentiating and specializing. I don't think they're probably going to offer a very low-cost product to capture, those grandmothers like my grandmother who may have interest in email and may have interest in, Googling something, but, she's not watching YouTube. She's certainly not doing torrent. I don't see these companies potentially devaluing their product by offering a $5 or $10 a month, sort of scavenger class or very low speed introductory package. In fact, I think they're concentrating on the very, very high packages because they want the perception of the value of the product to be going up, not necessarily going down.
So you don't think the government needs to be active in promoting faster speeds? You think the marketplace is going to take care of that?
No, that's not what I'm saying. No, I think that the government does have a very good, strong role to play in thinking about creating and supporting, the private sector to make investments in a very world-class network that will be very robust. The government also has a very strong interest in trying to bridge the broadband adoption gap, and one way of doing that is trying to get people online who may be their sole factor for not adopting is price. But I just don't really see that the companies are ever going to offer a $5 or $10 service offering because it does inherently devalue the perception of their product.
Do you think this is the right role of government to promote higher speeds, or is that too paternalistic, too intrusive?
I think that this evidence suggests that the higher speed and the higher value consumer is what people are chasing. That's the one niche of the market that's most likely to get served. I actually think that I have a more optimistic view than Derek does, which is if you look at you can contrast DSL's pricing structure with cable's. Cable has traditionally upgraded its bandwidth and kept it mostly in a single class of service, and actually not changed the price point. They've just increased the bandwidth provided as a service to their customers in largely the same class. DSL, particularly in the dial-up transition days, did offer, not in the 5 to 10 range, but about $12.95, somewhere around there.
For 6 months with asterisks.
But for very low bandwidth services.
If you also subscribe to telephones.
But bundling is one of the real issues about how to make all of this work. But they have differentiated on bandwidth tiers more aggressively than cable has, including appealing to former dial-up users that move over. And I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the fully loaded services on a promotional basis. Some did have a sub $20 low bandwidth service as a transition up from dial-up service. Now, which of those companies has the better business model? And I understand they're cannibalizing some of their sales on. My reaction is that is not a policymaker's decision to decide. We should allow the cable company to make its bet. We should allow the telephone company to make its bet. And the shareholder, we're not here to bail out shareholders either as a policymaker from a policy standpoint. They take the risks. The investors put their money where they want. And we see that's why you get equity returns along with the equity risks.
Yes, the only thing I'd add to that is I completely agree with what you outlined as the role, but I think it's true that attitudes towards pricing, bundling, and product offering drives a lot of that decision. I think what's also true, and that we shouldn't lose sight of, is there are different structural characteristics within each of the different operators' networks, right? What's the fixed cost per customer? What's the total cost to upgrade? How do you think about the fact that I need to get a certain penetration at some level, and that I'm hoping I'm going to drag those guys along and upgrade later? all of those are structural characteristics and very different cost structures between DSL and cable that I think play a role in how they think about the pricing as well.
Absolutely.
Just one brief point about
Yeah.
the low end market or the grandma user. Today and certainly in the next couple of years, wireless will be able to fill basically all of these basic needs of email and basic web surfing. So it's another very substantial competitor that, even though I agree with the professor that there are some very affordable options today in the wireline, you're certainly going to get even more affordable low-end options using wireless.
Just following up you, Mr. Swanson, Professor Yu talked about the killer app that for years we've heard about. Is there a killer app out there for broadband that will help drive adoption? He mentioned video. You think that's the right one, or is there something else that you perceive on the horizon?
I think it's clearly A1, and obviously the last couple of years, whether it was YouTube, the user-generated content, or Hulu, some of the more sophisticated services, and we've seen that video's already been a huge driver. I think it'll continue to be so, and I think you'll see ever more diversity in the video offerings. There will be even more low-end amateur-type video, and there will also be even more high-end, specially produced video, especially for the internet, and it will certainly impinge and disaggregate the whole, the cable TV model, and the cable will have to adjust as more video goes to the net. So I think there are a number of killer apps in that video arena. One arena that I've been looking at, which I think is pretty interesting, whether you call it a killer app or not, it's certainly something that's new and will be coming down the pike, is sort of what you might call it cloud computing 2.0. A little company I know out in Hollywood is building a cloud supercomputer. It's really the first supercomputer ever built not with microprocessors, but with graphics processors. So they take 1,000 graphics processors, link them together, and they are able to do real-time cinematic quality 3D video over the internet. So whether you want to use that for online gaming, whether you want to use that for very photorealistic virtual worlds, you can imagine any sort of educational uses for this. So essentially it's the next step beyond YouTube video, which is static and downstream. This is interactive video, and that I think is a next step. It may not be the killer app. I think it's something that's interesting, and it points toward something else about the network, which is when you're rendering video in the cloud, out in the network, you need both very high capacity and very low latency, and so you need very high capacity, very robust networks.
From a consumer standpoint, and that's something you work on, you see a difference in so-called killer apps or important new developments that might drive wireless adoption as opposed to wireline broadband?
Well, I mean, I think when we talk about wireless, I think what we all probably mean is mobile wireless and the handheld, on portability. What's driving that is essentially, people are porting over their internet experience that they're traditionally used to where they're going. I still think, even as we go forward, that they will probably, for the foreseeable future, exist in separate markets, and that the applications that are primarily driving growth in the high-end wireline market won't necessarily be the types of applications that consumers want to access and want to use or will make great use of in a mobile sector. I certainly wish one day that mobile products would become a fully competitive and viable option for consumers to wireline products, but I just don't see the market developing in that way. Yes, LTE will be very fast and very robust, but I still think the actual achieved speeds will still be quite fractional compared to what you'll see in DOCSIS 3.0 or fiber offerings or even VDSL2 offerings. So I think different applications and different considerations will drive the build out and adoption of both products.
Derek may be right. The evidence suggests that now there are 59 million mobile wireless subscribers, broadband, and that now is more subscribers than cable or telephone-based. And so what this suggests is that, in fact, wireless has become an important platform. If you look globally, in fact, they're skipping the wireline step altogether, and in fact, a lot of the payout is global. There are going to be a lot of drivers coming out of that. And I actually think that there's more, I'm somewhat more optimistic. But what's interesting is if you look at the classic economics, we've kind of been discussing things as if you're going to end up with one connection. I actually don't believe that, this is the convergence, the myth of total convergence. I don't think there's a world in which I have one connection. I will always have a wireline connection and a mobility connection. And I will probably continue to buy both, in which case it's interesting. Even though they're imperfect substitutes, the fact that you have two ways to get to me broadens the competitive space, improves the policy space, because if you have two ways to get to me, even if one of them is not as effective as the other, it exerts a form of price discipline. It narrows the scope of the policy problem. It narrows the market power wielded by the wireline provider in ways that are very, very interesting and very helpful. And what is striking to me is that it means also that no connection has to be everything to everybody. And we have this idea that the seamless internet, you have to reach everything to every place on exactly the same terms. As has been pointed out here, the technology doesn't do that. I mean, it's just not going to be the case. And one-size-fits-all rules aren't going to work anymore because it's not a one-size-fits-all technology. And I think there's a demand-side benefit to this, but I think that there's a competitive dimension to this that really helps in the literature on multi-homing and adapters out of the network economics literature that says that can limit whatever market power any one provider has if you have two connections, even if they're imperfectly competitive, because that'll exert discipline in certain sectors.
Well, that's right. So, this doesn't have to be, a perfect substitute for my wireline connection in order to have, discipline to pricing behavior. But as it stands now, this provides about a tenth of the speed as my Fios connection at home, which is half the price as this cost me to carry it around. And going forward, with Verizon and AT&T controlling 80% of the wireless market, the wireless data market, I'm not too sure that they are going to be eager to start cannibalizing their wireline products, especially Verizon, who's spent a lot of capex over the past 5 years building that product.
Well, I guess there's some problems. This space is never going to be as competitive as we'd want in a perfect world. It's just the nature of the business. We're not going to see 5, not going to see 10 competitors in this space. And so, that as an aspiration is a world that's never going to come. I do think Verizon is an interesting example. Verizon has abandoned defending its wireline business. They've made a public statement that they're not going to do that. They are trying to build out some of the Fios stuff, but right now the revenues are largely coming in wireless. A lot of companies are basically pinning their hopes on sort of those streams. And when we see, 79% of all messages come from wireless devices now. It's not a desktop PC world anymore. This is globally. Not just here. I can't remember the numbers. An astronomical, ridiculous amount of video is being watched on wireless devices. They don't have the same bandwidth. You might have to stream and store and take advantage of storage capabilities to do it. But there are some signs that people are making that migration and finding technical solutions to allow them to watch video even despite the fact that bandwidth is so limited on those devices.
Mr. Curtis, as you fashion the national broadband plan, how are you considering whether the proposed policies you have might have an adverse impact on network investment?
Well, without going into a great deal of detail on that, I'll say that sorry.
Next February. Right?
Next February. Look, let me say, I think that's one of the key things that we have to consider, and I guess the way I'll explain how we're thinking about it is as follows. Take the unserved areas. We're supposed to come up with a plan that gets service to people who are currently unserved. And we want to do so in as economically a rational way as we can. And we know that, as we've discussed on this panel, the definition of broadband or the demand for broadband is going to evolve over time. So it's quite important that the things that we decide to support and do are consistent with an evolutionary view of the network. And it just makes no sense to make a decision today for the purpose of getting broadband out quickly that handcuffs you when, you know, broadband continues to grow at roughly a 30 or 40% CAGR. So we're taking what I would call as a total cost of ownership view about the policy choices that can be made, the investments that need to be made, and trying to look over really a 20 or 30 year explicit period of how these different scenarios play out and drive and maximize the extent to which private capital can be deployed to solve these problems as opposed to public capital.
Mr. Swanson, Mr. Turner here in my immediate right, and I'll ask him about this in a minute, recently authored a report purporting to demonstrate that new network neutrality regulations, which we will explore more in the second panel, would not adversely impact network investments. Do you have any view on that?
I think it depends. I think that the likelihood is that a new network neutrality regime, depending on how it's written, depending on how it's interpreted, could have serious negative consequences for investment. But we don't know what that's going to look like yet. I mean, I think after the 96 Act, the 96 Act was supposedly deregulatory. We found that after many millions of words of legislation and interpretations and enforcements, turned out to have, I think, highly negative consequences in the networks themselves. It pushed some investment towards certain parts of the network. It pulled other investment out of certain parts of the network. So you had really a misallocation of capital. And the same thing could happen here. I did read Derek's report, and I think the idea that we had any sort of real network neutrality regime after the AT&T merger requirements the last couple of years, it's just not a really useful comparison to what the new network neutrality regime would be, which would be presumably more robust with eager enforcement and so forth. I just don't think it's useful to compare the two.
Mr. Turner?
Yeah, so look, the point we were trying to make in the report is that, you've got Joe Barton writing letters that net neutrality will be catastrophic for investment. And the point in writing the report is that investment decisions are incredibly complex. When firms make investment decisions, they consider a number of factors. Regulation is one of them, and regulation is not itself this monolithic thing. It can be very heavy-handed or it can be very light. And the point of the paper is to say, okay, yes, we don't have a lot of experimental data here, but the best thing we can probably look at is the AT&T Bell South merger conditions, which were very, very strict net neutrality conditions, arguably a lot more strict than the very flexible regime that's posed in the current NPRM, and that AT&T's investment went up. Now, am I saying that net neutrality was the cause of that? Absolutely not. But what I am saying is that the impact of this one specific regulation on investment in the core, in the actual, the ISP sector, it's not so obvious which way that'll go. And there is a good argument to be made that the lack of an open platform, the lack of certainty for edge innovators could potentially dampen VC investment, could potentially dampen investment there. Now, as to the 1996 Act, Links had this debate with Blair, and we can debate this now. I would argue that the 1996 Act, because the focus of that was to create competition in what had traditionally been a sector that wasn't very competitive, that coupled with rapid technological change led to the incumbents who were under heavy regulation to make massive investments. And alongside of that, a lot of CLECs made a lot of investments, and a lot of those companies did go belly up, but money was being spent, investment was being made. Yes, there may have been some misallocation of capital, but the notion that regulation, whatever that means, always deters investment, I think is something we should be a little bit more skeptical about and actually model out what we think is going to be the scenario that takes place.
Are there any kinds of government regulation in this area that you think would adversely impact broadband network investment?
Well, look, you've never seen, everyone thinks free press is some type of pro-regulatory Marxist group. You've never seen us say that we want retail price regulation. And I do think that heavy-handed retail price regulation could potentially cause companies to think twice about making investments. So there are different flavors of investment. Some are more heavy-handed than others.
Okay, Derek, then we'll take Professor Yu. Go ahead, Mr. Swanson.
Oh, just to reply, it's true that we can't see into the future and know exactly what the rules will look like today, how they'll be enforced by either this administration or another administration, how Congress might step in, how litigation from net neutrality could, potentially go on for years, as we saw in the last regulatory regime, which I think was a major distraction and impediment. So we can't know for sure. I think one thing we do know today is that the entire internet ecosystem, whether it's on the network side, the wireless side, the application side, the data center side, is very healthy. It's growing. Investment is booming. We had, $455 billion in capital investment last year in the ICT sector. So I think that the burden of proof is on those who want a new regulatory regime, not on those of us who say things are working really well, let's keep moving forward.
Professor Yu?
I'm probably less optimistic about the 96 regime than Derek is. There's some studies, empirical studies about the impact of investment domestically, which we may not see eye to eye on. What's interesting is we're starting to see international data. I mean, we've been remarkably successful at exporting unbundling as a regulatory philosophy to the point where the OECD has embraced it. And they're starting to do broad cross-sectional studies, and by and large, they find that unbundling is not correlated with network investment. And to some extent, in some studies, are concluding that it's negatively correlated with network investment because they're granting access to the existing monopoly loop. And that leads, the empirical evidence to me gives some reason to be pessimistic. The other reason to be pessimistic is the reason that Rob gave earlier, which is this is multidimensional. Even telephone was fairly multidimensional. One of my favorite stories about unbundling is someone came in to do, a CLEC came in, the obvious thing is to degrade the tier, lower the cost of the product, which then causes the regulators to start thinking about regulating quality, and the number of dimensions in which quality can vary increases the breadth of it, and not only that, but the nature of the relationship. And that's in a world where it's not just bits coming through on TCP, where we're starting to see much, much broader structures. This is going to be very, very hard to do. And if I were to create one success model out there, which I have not seen discussed enough, it's something I mentioned almost every chance. There's a company, a little UK ISP called PlusNet, which sells 7 classes of service identified with DPI and is rated as has the highest consumer satisfaction rating of any ISP in Britain. It was just bought by BT, which, people say that we don't know what's going to change, whether that's going to change their business model, but it's an example of a very aggressive, creative pricing structure that is delivering real value to consumers.
All right, I clearly have abysmally failed to stump the panel here, so now it's your turn, and I'd like again to ask you to just, if you would, stand, speak it loudly, and identify yourself, please.
Okay, thanks very much. My name is Tom Best. I'm a longtime professional medhead who started out life as a PhD in bellhead economics. Actually, my question first question first.
We'll take one at a time because we want to spread it around. We'll maybe get back to you.
This is really is interesting that you, very interested to hear about the model you're developing and this comparison to the ACPM. I'm wondering how you're going to take into account the lessons of PCPM. Let me suggest 3 things that I want to bring addressed. Why PCPM was developed, where it was successful and where it abjectly failed. Why, basically to try to develop some sense of transparency and actual cost. How are you going to avoid the fate of the original? Where was it successful? Where it was indirectly applied in the international context, where bypass was possible.
All right.
Yes.
Let's take the end.
Where it failed, of course, in the context of domestic infrastructure unbundling.
Yeah, so I think I'll avoid talking about BCPM. I'll talk about what we're doing. Right? I think it's incumbent upon us to come up with the best estimate that we possibly can about how much different choices cost. I'm happy to talk to you offline about all the data. Actually, you'll have to wait till February to see it. A lot of it's going to be published. but let me just say, right, every possible step within a span of 6 months that can be taken to make it as accurate as possible, it's a model, so it's not perfect, is going to be taken.
Okay? Let's just take the next question if we could.
Hi,
Go
Ron
ahead.
Wallach, before I got one. Just a quick follow-up, you said the economic model and analysis will be published in February, so will that not be put out for comment as long with the data sets? Or?
I don't think a decision's been made about putting it out for comment. We're on a very short time cycle.
Okay? Yes, Scott? Scott Cleveland.
Scott Cleveland at competition.org. To follow up on your question about being open and transparent, we all know that any model, no matter how much size and how much data you have a few very sensitive variables. Will you all be transparent in sharing with people the sensitivity analysis and which variables are driving most, and even potentially like financial models are done right now, and also say, here's my model, play with it, so you can see what the results should be.
I do not know that we have determined the exact details of what will be put out, what won't be put out. I can tell you that in the very near future, after February, I think you will see a very large appendix on output. I think you will see documentation on the model. I think, but cannot commit, that you will be able to play with, at the very least, lots of the derivative data. There's a lot of raw data that needs to be protected. That's my point of view. Not sure
I'm not going to
all
speak
that's going to happen.
for Rob or the FCC, but I think we're on like the 12th public notice on the National Broadband Plan, so these guys aren't afraid of asking public comment and asking for questions.
They've been wonderful.
All right, let's ask a question perhaps of some of our other panelists. Yes, sir.
David Green, NBC Universal. There's been some talk that there has been a killer app already, and it's piracy, and of course the victims of the piracy are those who produce legitimate content. As you look to the future of the internet, how do you see being able to protect legitimate content from piracy and the opportunities for the network to do that?
Anybody want to answer that?
Well, I think one of the best ways is to make content easily and legally available, and people will tend to migrate from being pirates to being active purchasers of content. There always will be a piracy problem, and it's important that we state unequivocally that the net neutrality rules being proposed at the Commission only protect legal content. There's potentially a safe harbor. There's potentially ways that ISPs can deal with the issue of piracy. Having said that, we don't want to encourage or allow overly captive or overly aggressive solutions. But again, I fundamentally think the best way to solve the piracy issue is to make content legally and easily available, and people will be happy to purchase it.
Professor Yu?
I think that is a big part of the solution, and obviously with iTunes and all, we've been much better. We made it more available in a legal way. I don't think it's complete, and I think that in fact different things like video and audio fingerprint technology have changed the analysis in fundamental ways. I mean, I think of it in law as a policy guy, as a policy wonk. Where's the least cost place to screen this stuff? It used to be really infeasible, but with these sorts of technologies, it can be done in the network very, very cheaply in a very, very effective way. So what you're starting to see is DMCA takedown notices are no longer specifying URLs. They're giving people actual fingerprints and saying, this is the nature of the signature. And it's an interesting question. There's been some actually people who've been very reluctant to go in this space to become much more sympathetic to saying, look, if this is going to be a problem that be stopped, we might have to think about different ways of solving it, such as network-based solutions.
Other questions here? Yes, sir. If you stand and identify yourself.
Stand up and sit down. Okay, Alex Howard, searchcompliance.com. I'm an IT journalist, and one of the things that we look at is broadband penetration. And U.S. has dropped to 19 in that area. And it's estimated that somewhere around a third of the U.S. has access to broadband but hasn't actually gotten to it. And I can tell you, as a consumer who's been in different networks and has wanted to access broadband, there's usually two options, choice between a telephone company and cable company. That's changing with wireless broadband.
You know, I think if you look at some of the people working on the broadband plan, the looks on their faces, the adoption issue is incredibly complex, and it is not, you know, there's no magic bullet for that. The issue of price is important to some consumers who haven't adopted. The issue of perceived value is important to them. But, you know, ultimately, what's the adoption rate of cable television or multi-video channel television? It's maybe about 90%. There's going to be an upper limit. You know, we're not going to reach 100% adoption ever, and there's going to be an upper limit, and right now maybe we're about 66%. We can get some of the rest of that due to lack of availability. We can get some of the rest of that due to lowering prices and increasing competition, which in turn increases value. And we can probably get to some of that through training and you know, just general digital awareness. But it's that last sort of 15% is not going to adopt as quickly as the first part. And public policy can play a role in some of this, but I think the private sector and the nonprofit sector are going to have to play a big role. Yes, open access is a policy I think that is something that we should look at. We're a little different here in the U.S. because of our, you know, nature that we do have two platforms. Some of the countries where open access has worked well has had a single monopoly copper platform, but it's worked well in other places that do have cable, like the Netherlands. And I certainly hope the FCC is looking at it as a part of its national broadband plan. But if you think it was hard to pass net neutrality rules, just wait till you try to pass open access rules.
Professor?
Derek makes a very important point, which is you have to make sure you're comparing apples and oranges here. A lot of companies are simply reselling a monopoly loop, which does, and the price competition you're seeing is entirely an artifact of the regulated price of the wholesale offering which they can resell. And so they've got 10 providers, but it's basically as if they're all buying the same fruit in the back room and you've got 10 vendors, they're giving you the exact same product. So I mean, the real key is to focus on facilities-based competition and how that actually works. And in that sense, actually, what's interesting is the U.S. has been remarkably successful in many ways at doing at promoting facilities-based competition. There are a lot of people who are ahead of us. Korea's subsidizing its build-out as a sort of a test bed for deploying it. That is a strategy that's open to us. It's an unlikely one in the political environment we're in. There's a wonderful study I saw presented. A lot of the Korean stuff was done by blatant illegality. What they were doing is overlashing wires to utility poles to which they had no legal authority to do so whatsoever. And the density was very, you can look at all the stories, they're much, much more complex. I actually think that in terms of facilities-based competition, that's how we should really be focusing on it. And the U.S. story is actually much more promising in many ways.
All right, yes, oh, all right, well now, I want to give anybody who hasn't had it before we go back a second round. Anybody else want a first question? Yeah, okay, yes, sir?
Good morning. My name is Dennis Caston, and I'm a retired counseling and consulting psychologist with the Department of Veterans Affairs. My question goes to the consumer side of technology. I have a number of friends, and myself included, and we're comfortable with the level of technology in our lives that meets our needs. We don't necessarily want more or desire more. Some of us are comfortable with crawling, and don't desire to walk. Others are more comfortable walking and don't have a desire to run. In terms of the speed of innovation in technology, a desire, a quest for more, bigger, better, faster, shouldn't there be some level of limits and boundaries in place so that we can comfortably master what we already have rather than leaping full speed ahead?
All right, Mr. Swanson, do you want to take that?
Sure. You know, I think it's the nature of technology and the pace of change, particularly that we've seen in digital silicon fiber technologies, you know, all coming back sort of to Moore's Law, that the pace of these things can make us uncomfortable in certain ways. It changes our culture, it changes our businesses, it changes our lives in ways that we're not always ready to accept or to embrace. But I don't think that there's really much we can do, you know, from a top-down manner to slow that down. Now, you know, software companies are constantly trying to make it, you know, their products more user-friendly so that, you know, whether it was the graphical user interface that really brought the World Wide Web to life in the mid-90s and that really started the first mass internet boom. So we've got a lot of companies, it's in their own self-interest to try to make things more user-friendly and try to take out the geek technology and make it available to the masses. And I think they're they're always doing that. But apart from some things we might do to, that would be bad for the economy or bad for investment, that would, marginally slow down the pace of technology, I think these things are really too powerful for us to restrain. And so it's incumbent upon us and nonprofit groups and companies themselves to try to make, the applications of the technologies fit our lives rather than topple.
I agree. I mean, you certainly don't want to slow down the pace of technology adoption and innovation in the United States, since we are largely shifting from a manufacturing-based economy to an information-based economy. Jobs depend on the pace of innovation being rapid. But at the same time, you have to watch out for the digital divide, because the cost of being off-network, increase almost exponentially when you're off-network as technology advances. So that's why I think it's important that we look at existing programs that we already have, like the schools and libraries programs as a part of the USF. I mean, we allocated $350 billion ostensibly for the purpose, or $350 million for the purpose of mapping and digital literacy and training. And I think the way that the NTIA has allocated that money was exactly backwards. Mapping is cheap and easy to do. We should have been spending most of that money on training people on how to use technology.
Professor Wu, I'm going to give you the last comment, then we've got to move on to our second program.
Well, I feel your pain. My mother-in-law recently wanted to buy a new sewing machine. She wanted one that wasn't computerized, just sewed. She couldn't find one. I mean, she just wanted to sew. And in this day and age, it becomes very hard to do. I think variety is a tremendous solution here. And think about, there are cell phones that have, for older citizens, big buttons and have dial tone. They mimic the experience of the old-fashioned phone. And that we can have and options, not or options, that make this better. And it's not just older people who are used to technology. As we computerize and ubiquitous computing, we got to move away from the world where you're staring at a computer screen and inputting data. And they're making newer interfaces that are actually taking the burden off all of us, that are actually going to make that better. The one other thing that, at Dick's prompting, there's one other thing to throw out in terms of the broadband adoption numbers, which is interesting, is there's a vibrant discussion about whether, if we're 19th, what number do we want to be? Would you want to be first? On some level, yes. On some level, there's such a thing as adopting too fast, and that gets complicated. But there are many metrics that are out there right now about adoption. Productivity, we actually rate very well in terms of the actual usage. The fact that it's not being taken up at the same rates that people would like. It's a much more interesting problem that is probably beyond the scope of what we can talk about here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a great discussion. Let's thank our excellent panel. As we shift to panel 2, you can stretch a little bit, and we're going to get started very quickly. Second panel now, which of course is network management and delivering for the consumer. I might say when we get to the last 15 minutes and we take questions, I've been advised that you have to speak from the wireless mic, and we will be passing around. John Henke's going to help me with that, so that we can pick it up on the webcast that we have going on. So let's do that if we can. Let me start out again with just a little opening, and I'm going to let this panel have a couple of minutes each, since we have all four here together. One of the most contentious issues, and we touched on it just toward the end, in this whole area of network management is, of course, network neutrality, which often devolves into a debate on whether traffic prioritization runs the risk of creating fast lanes and slow lanes on the public internet, and discrimination that some feel we do not want. And network management also raises questions regarding innovation on the web. Some assert that broadband networks should just be dumb pipes, so that innovation will occur only at the edge of the internet. Others counter that intelligence in the network will facilitate greater technical advances and better serve consumer interests. Last week, of course, as we've been discussing, the FCC released its lengthy notice of proposed rulemaking, setting forth possible new network neutrality regulations, so-called 6 principles that now would be codified. Each would be subject, as you may have noticed, to so-called reasonable network management. And the notice seeks comment on a somewhat open-ended definition of that term. It suggests that it might include practices to, 1, mitigate network congestion or address quality of service concerns, 2, deal with unwanted or harmful traffic, 3, prevent the transfer of unlawful conduct, and conversely, 4, prevent the unlawful transfer of content. The FCC's approach to reasonable network management, I think, is certain to be subject to considerable debate in the NPRM comments to come, and I'll predict in this discussion that we're going to have this morning among our distinguished panel members. And let's briefly meet them. Again, I'm going to be very brief because they're quite well known. Richard Bennett is Research Fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, specializing in broadband networking and internet policy. On my immediate left is Rob Topolsky, who is Chief Technology for Open Technology Initiative of New American Foundation. He also consults with Public Knowledge and Free Press. On my immediate right is David Farber, who is Distinguished Career Professor of Computer Science and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science. He was, of course, formerly Chief Technologist at the FCC and has been called not the father of the Internet, but the grandfather of the Internet. That's pretty good. And finally, on my far right is Harold Feld, who is Legal Director of Public Knowledge and acting as the head attorney on issues before the FCC and other government bodies. Previously, he was Senior Vice President of the Media Access Project. So let's start with Professor Bennett. Do you have some opening remarks?
Hi. Yeah. As an engineer, I jumped into this policy debate back in about 2002 when I discovered that Larry Lessig and some other folks were trying to address the issue of unbundling or separating transport services on networks from content because I felt like they were going down an unproductive path. One of the fundamental problems that we have in trying to support the kinds of new applications that people want to use on the internet today is the fact that applications don't all have the same requirements. They don't have the same requirements in terms of what we call latency, which is the delay of packets across transiting a network. They don't have the same requirements in terms of cost. And our thinking about this, I think, has been kind of warped by the fact that for most of the history of the internet as a publicly used system, we pretty much tended to just use one application pretty much to the exclusion of all others, and that's web surfing. And so we've kind of grown up with the internet in this context where everybody uses the network for the same thing. Therefore, it's kind of sensible for the network to provide a single delivery service to everybody. And there's some applications that kind of strain under that a little bit, but for the most part, it's worked pretty well. We're going into a world where applications are becoming more diverse. So we have, at the same time that we're continuing to do web surfing and email and these legacy kind of traditional applications that don't place a lot of load on the network infrastructure, we also want to do video, not just streaming video, but video conferencing, which is an intensely real-time application that goes in both directions. We also want to move massively large files, like in the file backup case that Brett Swanson brought up on the first panel, and in the peer-to-peer case that we're familiar with, due to the litigation over the last couple of years. So moving into this kind of world, it makes sense for the internet to adopt some of the standards that have been developed in the internet engineering community but haven't been widely deployed commercially, like differentiated services and integrated services, which are mechanisms that provide different levels of quality of service to different applications. So it kind of goes, there was some discussion about a scavenger class on the first panel, and it kind of sounded like that was a characteristic of an account. And it's not really a characteristic of an account, it's a characteristic of a particular application. And so I think we're moving towards a world where users and applications need to be able to communicate to the network the requirements they have for their particular transactions, and for those things to be priced in a rational manner, and for the revenues that the carriers collect from doing that to help pay for network upgrades.
All right, Rob?
My interest in digital communications probably began 25 years or so ago with amateur radio teletype, and it has continued to the present day internet. My last job was performing quality assurance and testing for networking product groups at Intel Corporation. My policy involvement started one day when I just documented how Comcast was secretly blocking peer-to-peer file sharing uploads, and that test and its results were repeated independently, and that started the conversation that reignited the net neutrality debate. My role here in DC is one of being a technology explainer with people like Harold Feld on this panel and Derek Turner on the last one. You don't need me to tell you that the idea of open and non-discriminatory access to our general purpose communication networks has been part of our practice and our law all along. And as you know, the internet is the latest of civilization's general purpose networks. This panel is about network management and delivering for the consumer, faster, smarter, better. There was a day when those developing hardware for the carrier market, the ISPs, were laser focused only on faster. And in its early years, the internet was straining with more than 100% growth year after year, and network vendors were pouring R&D into only more speed. Every last bit per second this technology created was eagerly waited and quickly consumed. And the net was neutral because the routers naturally followed the idea that traffic would be handled in the order it is received. But the days of faster became numbered. ISPs slowed their spread across the land. Network vendors, seeing ISPs reluctant to continue in speed-driven upgrade cycles, began creating new market segments in order to detect, to permit monetization of internet communications by detecting and blocking high volume usage and automating traditionally manual support functions. Many of these features were already available for the enterprise market, those private networks that weren't part of the internet ecosystem. But now the processing power became available through Moore's Law to make them available to ISPs and carriers at wire speed. So smarter became the new driver, or at least a driver in concert with faster. And technological innovation still drives wire speeds faster over time, but significant R&D is now spent on identifying and managing the ISP's network. Now, some packets get treated differently than others, not always forwarded as they normally would be, and not in the order received. And when this happens, the internet becomes less general purpose in nature. It's friendlier towards some uses and hostile, more hostile towards others. In that environment, one can't safely predict and develop network products for the internet, because the internet works differently in one place than it works in another. And as this continues, the open internet becomes more and more closed to new ideas and uses. Smarter is not a bad thing. I'm not the enemy of innovation or technology here. The processing power that enables it is also not a bad thing. But with greater power comes greater responsibility to preserve the internet's operating principles and standards, those things that keep it open.
All right, thank you. David, some
Yeah.
opening remarks perhaps?
Okay. Now, I've been around the network for a long, long time. Helped develop some of the early nets in conjunction with Larry Landweber there. The term grandfather of the internet, I was thesis advisor for some of the people who were actually fathers of the internet, like John Postel, and others. The internet is a complicated beast. Somehow we focus on the first mile, or at least the ISPs we see. But remember, the internet has many, many substructures. There are transient networks that deal with moving bits from a Verizon node to a Comcast node. And there are many of those networks with peering agreements between each other and with specialization. We talk as if they don't exist. There are special nets like Google's backbone network, which moves their traffic in a priority manner to caches within closer to the customers. laying down simplistic rules to make one think that it's all that first mile just doesn't recognize the complexity of the internet. Some of the internet traffic between us goes through foreign sites, especially up around the Canadian border. It moves back and forth across the border with rare abandon. It's a little hard to see how the FCC can manage to dictate what happens there. The thing that worries me the most, two things worry me the most. One is innovation. Much of the network innovation has come out of a combination of research activities and an organization called the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, which is an international organization that establishes default standards for things that operate on the worldwide internet. It's moved a lot of the technology forward. I can't see effectively a day where an activity of the IETF has to go before the FCC and say, is this a, quote, reasonable way of doing a certain form of network management? I mean, it will slow down things incredibly and potentially could end up with protocols being defined outside the U.S. and us becoming third world. I think it's important to recognize that complexity. The other point, and then I'll shut up for a minute, is that we sort of always assumed that we're at the peak of the internet and now it's just filling in the population. But technology does move forward whether we like it or not, and we'll probably move into an era where the fundamental architecture of our computer systems changes. You can see this beginning to happen in the light wave interconnects that several companies are postulating for future processors. If that happens, what we're going to see is a pressure on the internet itself, whatever that means, again, this big thing, to stop with the optical, electronic, and move towards a totally different architecture with maybe a totally different protocol. How long is that going to be? I suspect I won't see it, but I suspect that most of the people who come out of the universities will see that transition, as we saw the transition from 56 kilobits up. One more thing. What will we do with it? I don't know. If I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be making more money than Bill Gates or Steve Jobs right now. But one thing is sort of guaranteed, it will happen. We did a project many years ago under NSF auspices called the Gigabit Test Bed. When we did that, one of the critiques that was thrown at us, who would ever want a gigabit? Now the question is, only a gigabit? Where's my 100 gig network? And that's happening, certainly in the research communities now. Internet 2, National Lambda Rail are providing 10 to 100 gigabit connections for good use. Cloud computing is going to demand that. So we're in a constantly evolving space, and to put caps on it or to put federal ruling bodies in the middle of that, from my experience, is going to be catastrophic.
All right, thank you. Harold?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One of the, I suppose, nice things about coming with totally no idea of what I was going to say and being the last one up is I get to respond to what everybody else has put out there. But just a few thoughts first. One, I have to say that having been involved with internet policy for way too long now, but more than 10 years, and having been one of the few who got involved online well before that, although in this panel here, I'm still a newbie. But
Easy.
But one of the things that has always frustrated me when we discuss these things is that there are problems that have been dealt with constantly in the context of other environments, other networked environments, even other communications issues here in the United States, and we tend to just forget about how we've dealt with them and what the impact are and what historical lessons we have. To reach back just a little bit on the problem of network congestion, Some of us may remember all the way back to the late 90s when the wireless network was growing at a tremendous rate, and there were serious congestion problems. I can remember my first cell phone, and every rush hour, I'd try to place a call to my wife. This was 97, 98. And I couldn't get through. I'd get that all circuits are busy, the phone wouldn't connect simply because demand was growing too fast. The network was not meeting the need. Now, it would certainly have been possible for phone companies who were struggling at that point to engage in certain types of prioritization. They could decide that everybody gets 10 minutes and then you kick them off to try to spread the pain all around. They could have decided that you could pay for extra premium, you will always connect service, which is something we do, for example, in certain energy markets, what we call uninterruptible service. And everybody else who bought standard service, you just took your chances on whether the codes, whether the cell sites were available. Because there was a regulatory scheme in place that said, for this last mile connection of wireless, you're going to be common carriers. Those options were not open to the wireless providers, so they turned to different options. They invested in their networks, they engaged in roaming agreements, they went out and got more spectrum, they spent the money to build more towers. That may not have been their preferred solution at any given time, but the wireless network did not collapse. To the contrary, it continued to expand and develop rapidly, and the internal network management from a spectrum sharing and traffic management standpoint in that regard evolved, I think, in a very satisfying way for voice communication. We're now running into this problem again on the wireless side for data, where we're seeing the argument that we should be allowed to use different sorts of solutions, that because of this congestion, there is a need for flexibility. What distinguishes voice from data in this context? Why was it necessary in the last mile to say you can't do this in voice and you must be able to do this in data? I think that we should be asking ourselves, especially about some of these doomsday predictions about what will happen if we have federal rules in place, does history really bear this out? Or should we treat the regulatory environment as one more element, like the economic environment, like the terrain or other engineering challenges, as part of the equation? There will inevitably be trade-offs in what we do, but I do need to address one or two things that were said, which are important in consideration of those trade-offs. One is, with regard to Dave Farber's concern of how far this reach extends, at least with regard to the current notice of proposed rulemaking, the FCC is very clear. It's for broadband access providers. It's a focus on the last mile, and again, historically, we have concerns about the last mile. We have treated those players who are wholesale players or large enterprise players as being in a different position than the average consumer. We have concerns, I think, quite appropriately, as we have expanded this out and it's grown out, that we're loading an awful lot on a best efforts network. That it has served us very well, but with a lot of people depending on it, do we have to worry about what happens to the end user when things are not working in a reliable and predictable manner? When we allow companies to make these network decisions. And let me point to the Comcast decision. I want to try to wrap it up here, but let me talk to the Comcast decision as a classic problem of network management. If you look at what Comcast actually, filed at what it was doing, and you look at their settlement with the Florida Attorney General, it seems to suggest that they were proactively managing congestion by knocking off the largest users. They were not, at that time, actually experiencing congestion because every month they knocked off the top 1,000 users, and they generally used their traffic management system with regard to the reset packets, regardless of the level of congestion. But they were making an economic decision that if you do this, you don't have to spend more in CapEx just now. And if you train users not to use certain sorts of high bandwidth applications, you can manage the network in a way that is beneficial to most of the current users and is a more economic system. when required to change their management method, they were able to implement something that handled congestion traffic in a more neutral fashion. The question is, what would have happened to P2P, and in the year and a half that has followed, the many legitimate and millions of dollars of legitimate business that is taking place with those, if the network operator had been allowed to simply make a unilateral decision about how to manage its network in this fashion.
All right, thank you very much. Rob, let me start with you, Rob Tobolsky. Is it your view that since inception, the internet really has been a collection of dumb pipes, and that all websites, all features, all services should be treated the same?
Since the point where it became much more than just an experimental net and began to attract individual subscribers that weren't necessarily in the commercial or research arena, which is about the time that I joined. The internet, by and large, has been the dumb pipe concept, but there's a lot of intelligence in the routing and forwarding and that kind of practice. But the dumb in that the job of working out error-free communications and what packets needed to be repeated or what packets could be skipped was intelligence that was relegated to the endpoints. Yes, that's been around.
Yeah. Well, could you see the fact that there's some prioritization in the network that might be pro-consumer and pro-competitive?
So far, I think that we'll take pro-consumer first. I think that the intention, even in the case of the Comcast upload blocking, was in their mind a pro-consumer move that had negative consequences. It took the needs of some high number above 90 of the percent of the customers and treated them especially well against the needs of some lower number of people that were trying to contribute new content, legal content, to the peer-to-peer file sharing networks.
David?
Yeah, just a comment. Again, we tend to focus on the, let me call it the access network. And the core networks have always done fairly elaborate network management, especially as speeds gone up. They prioritize a lot of things. They route to get optimum use of the network. And let me just make a comment on what the FCC has to face. It doesn't do me any good to say that I have to treat everybody equal on the local access network. When I get to the place where it touches the backbone networks, they're going to do what they want to do. And right now, they do priority. They do a lot of things to increase their capacity to carry load. And very few people just deal with internal communication. You connect to a website that's someplace, God knows where. And so you're going to be treated to the management of the core of the transit networks. And that eventually will move the FCC to have to deal with the internet as a whole. Also, just for technical purposes, for years we've tried to do quality of service routing end-to-end, and it is very difficult. We do it within some of the networks, but we've never been able to make it work anything better than best effort quality of service end-to-end routing, end-to-end being processing, some foreign processing. But it's always been a goal of the network to try to do that, because there are a lot of applications that need quality of route of service. If you believe that you'll ever sit on an operating table with a remote surgeon, you're going to get really upset if some video stream slows down your interaction. And there are just things that you will not do unless you can get guarantees of latency and guarantees of bandwidth. And I think we just have to face that.
I actually agree. I'm sorry. If you want to. That is to say, I agree with much of what David says. That in fact, the preoccupation of the previous communications network, the telephone network, was all about reliability. It was one of the public utility 5 nines networks. And that was because the notion was people are depending on it for such a critical function, voice communication, that we must be able to control it end-to-end, guarantee the service, have set reliability features, and that was important for certain purposes. That had consequences in terms of the services that the network offered, the nature of the build-out, the nature of the economics of the construction of these networks. All of these things have their consequences, and there will be trade-offs. There are a lot of things that we like to believe will happen, and some of them may not happen. It may be indeed the case that to maximize the utility of the network, in the words of the National Band Plan statute, whatever that means, that we have to keep best efforts, and that best efforts will never be acceptable for certain uses. Public safety is a classic one where best efforts may never be enough.
Well, Harold, do you think the creation of fast lanes and slow lanes on the internet is a fundamental divergence from the basic open concept of the internet?
I do in the following ways. I think that number one, we all understand, and this is again where I am often accused of not understanding engineering, which is usually true. But I do think that sometimes there is a lack of appreciation for what folks in this debate do appreciate on this side. We understand, and the FCC certainly understands, that there has never been a day when all packets have been treated the same. That because the internet is, to quote from the language of a 1997 Supreme Court case, the network of networks, and that's why it's the definite article internet capital, because it's one global network in which networks participate, that has always meant that there are opportunities for things like local caching. There's things like what Akamai do. There is the building of what we call private networks, which is again an old telecommunications concept like Google, where Google or Comcast, which also has one, just hold their traffic as much as they can where it makes sense to, and contract to move it out where it's the most economically efficient point. And all these things have coexisted together so that stuff moves differently depending on a wide variety of circumstances. What we've never had before was the ability of the first mile or last mile or access provider to control for the end user based on factors that are not necessarily technical factors, based on factors that have to do with economic rents, based on factors that have to do with economic affiliation. And I look to the recent decision of the CRTC in Canada in its setting out of what a reasonable network management standard was, where I thought it addressed these things very efficiently.
Mr. Bennett, to what extent does packet differentiation occur in broadband networks today, generally?
That's a good question. Let's back up a little bit. People are talking about the internet as if it were a network, and not, as Harold says, the network of networks. Now, most of the packet differentiation that takes place is in the networks that are the constituent parts of the internet. I mean, what the internet itself actually does is simply defines a data format for moving information across networks. So if I have a network that's based on Wi-Fi, Rob has a network that's based on Ethernet with VLANs, David has a DOCSIS network, and Harold has a DSL network, all four of our networks are capable of differentiating traffic according to classes of service. So given that this is the technical reality, that all of these networks that are in common use have the capability of differentiating classes of service, what possible sense could it make to enact a law that says that the data format and the methodology of transferring information between our four networks has to disallow a fundamental capability that all of our networks have. I mean, this makes absolutely no sense. It's completely ludicrous. And in the design of the Internet protocol itself, in the IP header, which you can look up online, look up the request for comments that defines the IP protocol, there are 3 bits that are set aside to designate class of service or type of service. So there's one class for expedited delivery, which you need for voice. There's one for low-cost delivery, and then there's the generic sort of best efforts, treatment that most of the web traffic, uses on the Internet today. So there's no law. I mean, there's certainly nothing embedded in the design of the Internet that says everything has to be best efforts.
All right, did you want to comment?
Sure.
And then I know David does too.
In a response to that, nobody's proposing a law that says you can't use the type of service header or you can't use differentiated services. Those are part of the Internet's design since before probably even you started. I just called you old. Is that okay? But what we are saying is that a service operator can't differentiate traffic based on that the traffic is this service versus that service. The kind of the differentiation being not what the per hop instruction was sent by the end user, but some detection in the middle that this smells like a video packet.
This service against that service, what if this service requires more bits, more, load, really?
Right.
Wouldn't that make a difference?
Well, the current proposed network management standard actually allows that difference. I think that there's room to be concerned there, that the mere size of the packet is a factor because of the serial way or the funnel way that this stuff travels through a router, takes into account the size of a packet. You're going to get many more smaller packets through a router than you will very large packets in the same time frame.
Just to be clear, I have no sympathy for stupid companies that do stupid things. And I have a lot of friends at Comcast, and they did a stupid thing. Notice, though, that there are very few cases, at least where the FCC has had to rule on stupid activities. Companies have been reasonably careful. The current Comcast systems look reasonable and experimental. The nice thing about that environment is if you cut off bad behavior, and we don't need additional stuff to cut that off, that companies then have the freedom to try things out, and there's always customers sitting in the back, and a lot of techies will be happy to scream bloody hell when they do something bad.
David, the FCC's NPRM appears to endorse the concept that prioritization of packets might be permitted when it comes to law enforcement, public safety, and homeland and national security. Do you think prioritization should be limited to these circumstances?
No, I don't see any reason to do it. If there's a good reason to do it, fine, but there are a lot of activities which do have to be prioritized in order to give the customer at the end the service they ask for. Again, things that travel on the internet have a different sort of zest to them. That's maybe not an appropriate word, but the guy who was backing up his files over the internet basically didn't give a damn when they got there. And so, if the latency was very high, who the heck cares? In voice, you do care. In stored video, you don't care. In live video, you do care. Each one of them, though, has a different heartbeat, and a reasonable network has to be responsive to those heartbeats, because you can get away with some stuff on video that you can't get away with on voice.
Okay, Mr. Bennett, the FCC's notice also raises questions concerning managed services. What's the relationship, if any, between managed services and the FCC's proposed approach of reasonable network management?
Yeah, I think this is I think going to become one of the central questions around the NPRM, if not the central question, which is the managed services are what consumers know as triple play. I mean, that's one example of managed services. And triple play is obviously important because it's the revenue model that pays for the deployment of the next generation broadband network. So remember, the first generation broadband, the DSL and cable, was essentially we found some copper in the ground and somebody figured out a way to do high-speed data over it, you know, up to a certain level. And that was cool. People wanted more speed, and to get more speed, we have to improve the cable plant that's in the ground and on the poles. To pay for that upgrade, which we didn't have to do in first generation broadband, we just improved the electronics on the endpoints of existing cable. We need a revenue model, and the revenue model is triple play, because it turns out that Americans are not really willing to go into their pocketbooks and pay a whole lot of money just for high-speed internet by itself. The television and telephone are still more important to the average American and actually the average worldwide consumer of network services than internet is. I mean, after all, there's 4.5 billion people in the world that use wireless phones and about 1.6 billion people that use the internet after all this time. So the managed services are very important, and that has to be protected right now as a revenue model for the carriers that we're counting on to invest in the cable upgrades to bring us next generation broadband. But at the same time, innovation demands that people should be able to provide services, over-the-top services on the internet connection that mimic or maybe even replace, you know, the voice and video components of triple play. Now, I think where my friends on the pro-regulatory side have gotten themselves in trouble here is
I have to say I've agreed with everything you've said so far, so but go ahead.
Is that they want to have competitive over-the-top services, but they don't want to allow any kind of differentiation that's price-based differentiation on the services, on the transport service. So if it's necessary for the carrier, and the way triple play is implemented on carrier networks is that the telephone and video service is segregated from the internet access service, so that regardless of how much internet you want, the bandwidth is going to be reserved in the first instance for the managed service. If we're going to be competitive and over the top, a similar kind of reservation capability needs to be enabled for the applications that are for the over-the-top service. And it costs money to do that. I mean, that's why we pay more for our video and phone service that's a high-quality service offering as a part of the triple play than we do for, you know, similar services over the internet. So to really create the competitive scenario where over-the-top services from third parties can compete with managed services from the carriers, the people that provide those services are going to have to pay for the enhanced quality of service that the application requires. It's not simply a matter of manipulating and degrading and, you know, and deviating from the historical common carrier concept. It's a more refined, I think what we need is a more refined understanding of that, and to realize that, you know, that quality of service actually costs money to provide.
Harold, would you favor allowing a user to mark his or her packets with the kind of prioritization that the customer wants to get from their network?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I wrote about 1.5 years ago a blog piece, however you want. Users who, well, which is, you know, just to draw the parallel, right now that's how I get electricity. My demand for electricity and when my devices run is all the same, and it's managed by congestion pricing of I'm charged more at certain times of day. That's a very crude way to try to motivate me to use my electronic appliances at night when overall demand is lower. The ability to mark, but some people do it and they can afford to do it. The ability to mark priority for end users, it seems to me, is an important tool for managing congestion. Will it invariably solve all congestion problems? Probably not. We'll probably need a combination approach, as we do for most complex problems in the real world. But certainly, it is preferable from my perspective to allow the end user to decide that they favor one application over another than to have the last mile provider make that choice for the end user.
But if a user did say everything's top priority, shouldn't a broadband provider be allowed to take some steps to mitigate such a risk?
Well, but what's the risk here? You got what you know, if you do that, you have kind of a standard setting of, I've said, I'm getting, in terms from the end user, in theory, I'm getting some kind of capacity. Whether that's an outright capacity cap, whether there's an overall way in which you share pain and congestion within the network. Again, this is the decision the network operator is confronted with all the time. What we're talking about is adding the additional feature that would say, hey, let me, the user, tell you what I personally would like to see prioritized with regard to my particular traffic. That's going to, I think, have positive impacts, and it makes nobody worse off by giving users those options.
Yes,
Yeah,
Rob?
this is an incredibly great idea because it turns out that the types of packets that a user through his choice of applications would prefer be given some kind of a special priority through the network, some enhanced or assured forwarding, are about the same choices that the ISP would make if it was sniffing the packets using deep packet inspection or some other way. But the opening for abuse of that by, as you mentioned, marking all packets for the best possible and fastest treatment exists. And Harold came up with one way, which was, charge more for more. Another way would be to create quotas of the number of packets that you could mark for assured forwarding, and the number of packets you could mark for enhanced forwarding. And then once that quota is exhausted, everything would be handled best effort after that. And there are a couple other ways around this as well, but it is something that we ought to be looking seriously at if we're of the opinion that we can't increase speeds anymore. Because ultimately, this is about who goes first. This is about handling traffic in the order differently than it was received. And if we get into a situation where we can create additional bandwidth instead of creating lines, then all of this prioritization stuff goes away.
Yeah, the difficulty in imagining all these things in the abstract are there are many ways in which they could play out. The advantage of having a rule set which says, well, look, if you have customers, particularly residential customers who we've traditionally cared about in a particular way, and particularly where we are dealing in an economic situation where a few providers can have a disproportionate impact on the market because of their large market share. Note, I don't say market power, I'm just saying market share. What Comcast does has more impact than what a small ISP necessarily might do, at least in the short term. That having rules in place that govern how you can behave towards these customers guides the solutions that these ISPs will develop in order to solve the very real network management problems.
All right, David, let's talk a little bit about reasonable network management. What are your concerns about the FCC's approach to that? Do you think that the government ought to be in the business of defining what does and does not constitute reasonable network management?
I don't think the government, the FCC, as currently structured, has technical talent to deal with that. Well, bluntly, you can count on several handful, maybe a handful, how many people deeply knowledgeable of that there are there. How many show up at an ITF meeting from the FCC? 1 or 0? No, so it does require, if you go into this, it requires a totally new way of looking at the FCC. Maybe it should take on NIST as a subpart of the FCC, because that's what it's going to take.
Would you see an industry standards group being involved, or?
I think the IETF is actually doing a fairly good job in this area. It's international. It just doesn't apply to the U.S., and that's healthy. Vague terms worry me, because vague terms tend to create lifelong jobs for lawyers. And
not so bad, not all bad.
I think I'm going to go take a law degree.
You just offended half the room.
I know, I know.
And the moderator.
And the
They're
moderator.
used to it.
There's plenty of work for lawyers without adding to it. I don't want to slow things down, and reasonable doesn't jive with my ability to understand how I do network management. I may want to experiment. I may want to try new things, and if I have to face the fact that somebody is going to claim that what I'm doing is unreasonable and involve FCC and potentially the courts, I'm going to slow down. We have a mechanism that works, and barring a few stupid activities on the part of companies which have learned better, simple guidelines that say, look, boys, if you do the following things, the 4 principles work fairly well, and maybe you need another couple of principles, but the informal type of, if you do something wrong that violates what we think these principles are, we're going to have a talk with you.
Or you like the 4, how do you, and transparency okay?
Oh, transparency is always okay.
Okay, how about number 5, non-discrimination?
We always discriminate. That's my problem. The fact that a carrier allows a Google cache inside their premises is obviously discrimination to somebody who can't afford that. Is that bad discrimination? Yeah, big customers like it. Everybody seems to like it. You'd be hard pressed to see how to structure non-discrimination, and I just don't know how to do it.
How easy do you think, or how difficult do you think it is to distinguish between pro and anti-competitive non-discrimination?
Wow, it's
Prioritization.
a hard question for a technologist. I can tell you how the network works, but to figure out the economics pulling toward, I don't know. But I can tell you from a technical perspective that we encourage things like content delivery networks and private networks and things that make the trip shorter. Just like we like the idea that there are 7-Elevens in our neighborhood, so we don't have to make the longer drive to the supermarket. It's healthy to put the content somewhere in the vicinity of the person who's requesting it. How to solve the competitive struggles that might create, I couldn't answer that.
Okay. Richard, given the differences between wireline and wireless networks, should wireless broadband providers have greater latitude to engage in reasonable network management?
Oh, they absolutely do. I mean, this is, when I heard that the FCC wanted to enact, and Congress as well, with the Markey bill, wanted to enact, network neutrality standards. I mean, they've been threatening to do that for a long time. It wasn't really that shocking. But the idea that they wanted to take the same standards for wireline networks and apply those to wireless networks just drove me up a wall. I mean, the fundamental dynamic is that, with wireline networks, we can solve an awful lot of problems with bandwidth, as Rob was suggesting, although I don't think adding bandwidth is the panacea that Rob more or less represented it to be. Because no matter how much capacity we have on any given point on the Internet, the design of the protocols, the whole concept of packet switching says that applications should be able to use all the available bandwidth. I mean, that's kind of why these networks are designed this way. So congestion on a packet switch network like the Internet is not the same as congestion is on the public switch telephone network. In fact, we probably shouldn't even use that word, because it's the point of this design is to deploy bandwidth that can be fully saturated. We want to deploy pipes that can be fully saturated, which the public switch telephone network doesn't permit. So as we move with these kind of overly broad non-discrimination rules that would in fact make it illegal to conform to a lot of the Internet Engineering Task Force's standards and apply those to wireless networks, when wireless networks are so successful, so exploding, and so vital as a form of interpersonal communication around the world, it's just you wonder what people are smoking over there.
Harold, what are you smoking?
Well, in this case, I have to say, That's true for some of the decisions that are made with regard to wireless networks and not for others. It turned out there was not a particularly good technical reason why the iPhone could not be made available for other networks, except for a pure economic agreement between AT&T and Apple that's what they were going to do. There is no technical reason why certain applications need to get approval from Apple and are bounced because they are too controversially political or too obscene or too whatever. That is an economic decision that has nothing to do with the technical concerns. The notion that we should entirely divorce these problems of you have actors who have a host of concerns. Some are technical, some are economic, some are just, as Dave referred earlier, people doing stupid things. But in a market where two of the wireless providers control 60, 70% combined, and the remaining, and then the next two control another substantial share of the market, it doesn't take too many stupid people to crash or seriously impede a significant portion of our critical infrastructure. So the question becomes, how do you balance the interest of allowing the sort of technical management and technical differentiation that is absolutely necessary for maintaining the network in the first place with the demonstrable concerns with regard to how these actors behave and the impact on the rest of us?
Can I jump in on that?
All right, just one, and then I'll give David the last word, and we're going to go to the audience.
Okay, so Finland declared broadband a human right. Is Harold declaring the iPhone a human right? So, I mean, Apple builds this product. It only supports GSM networks. Doesn't work on CDMA. So we have to issue an order that says, Apple, you have to support CDMA networks as well?
My ambition is much more limited. I observe that we grew up in a wireline world where I can take any laptop I want and plug it into a network. And I can't do that on a wireless world. And there have been technical choices that were made all along the way that were shaped by the policy choices that were made here in Washington, D.C. by the FCC. The ability to buy whatever model HP, Dell, Apple computer I want and have it function on my Fios connection is a direct result of the Carter phone decision a long time ago and how networks evolved from that point onward.
Yeah,
people grew up with a particular set of expectations.
I would encourage people to go read Tim Wu's wireless Carter phone paper and pay special attention to the part where he says we need to have handset portability because it's impossible to develop applications for these wireless handsets.
Well, again, my point is we had a market. It developed in a particular way. I thought it worked out pretty well. My fundamental right here is not a fundamental right so much to the iPhone, but a industry and policy choice, which I say we should make, that separates the consumer electronic aspect of this market from the network management aspect of this market. A very humble and limited industrial policy, in my opinion.
All right, David, you got the last humble word here.
Okay, the last humble word is, in spite of obvious differences, there is a set of agreements, at least we can talk the same language among the technically knowledgeable set of people. And I'm not degrading the lawyers and the economists, but they each has their own language. It took me a long time to be able to talk to a constitutional lawyer. I can almost do it now. It seems to me that it would be a not bad idea, and it's hinted to in the FCC document, to get the technical people from all sides of this game together in a quiet room and decide, in fact, where the technology stands and where it doesn't stand. Provide guidance to both the FCC, the economists, and the legal side of the house, because when push comes to shove, the technology is going to rule. You're not going to be able to change the internet technology without really major conflicts with the rest of the world.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start right back here, and we'll get right here. Gentlemen, please stand up and identify yourself if you could. But we're going to take the wireless mic. John's going to help us with it.
My name is Chris Castle. I'm a lawyer. I represented Sean Fanning's first two companies, one of which probably everybody's heard of. When I hear these discussions about discrimination, I'm reminded of a great scene in The Untouchables where Malone says to Ness, everybody knows where the booze is. And when they went on their raid, there may have been a Canadian guy in the house who had a hip flask that he brought in with him across the border that he never drank from, and he intended to take with him back out, thereby not violating any laws. But he got caught up in the raid too, because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So my question is when we know that there are places like the Pirate Bay, and we know that this traffic is getting routed around various places on the internet, is it really discrimination to do whatever you can to block people who are 99.99% unauthorized?
David, you're going to take that one? Or
I'll take that one.
All right, Harold.
Yeah, as somebody who got cut off when I was trying to find a rehab facility for my wife when she was being discharged from the hospital a year and a half ago by my ISP because some bot misreported that I'd been downloading an episode of The Wire, which I don't watch. I'm a little nervous about the value that you place on the collateral damage. I will say that traditionally we have not done things like let companies sit in on the phone networks to see if somebody's plotting to steal their copyrighted material. We have generally criminalized things like the theft of cable, but have limited what you can do to go into customers' homes to make sure that they haven't done it unless you have some evidence of an actual crime being committed. And I will note most recently that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in its pursuit of the yes men, where I think, frankly, the question of fair use there is quite live and arguable, persuaded an ISP to cut off 400 other users as part of getting to some content that they didn't like. I think that the notion that somehow you can easily isolate the bad actors with some magic pill technology is a convenient fantasy. Indeed, one of the things that worries me enormously about the order as drafted by the FCC is that it is a stunning reversal of 75 years of communications policy.
All right, a brief comment, David, and we're going to go to the next question.
I will agree completely. I worry when people assume that everything on a given site is illegal. There's many legal things on Pirate Bay. It's the same as assuming that because something's labeled as pornographic, it is, even if it's... I remember I'll make it fast, going to RIAA when I was at the FCC, and they were showing me a list of all these illegal things, and one of them, a lot of them said child pornography next to it, which is obviously illegal. And the question was, is it? Or is it just labeled there to sort of tease people? You don't know. And blanket censorship of sites and behavior is just, it sort of defeats my First Amendment rights.
All right, we'll take this gentleman right here, I think, John.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go to the other back of the room and around, okay? Go ahead.
Thanks. Hello? Great. Okay, Tom Vest once again, former architect builder for the AOL ATDN Transit Network. Harold, actually, the market share statistics you quoted almost sounded like they could be an argument for too big to fail. But that's just a side comment.
All right, question?
My question is actually for Dr. Farber. Dr. Farber, you started off by talking about how regulation of broadband in the United States might discourage inbound foreign investment. Basically, the innovation domestically might drive innovation and service providers offshore. I think actually the cost of service delivery tends to be a bigger determinant of that, and I'm wondering if you're concerned about or if anybody in the panel has considered how the fairly poor cost to service ratio in the United States is likely to be driving innovation and inward foreign investment offshore anyway.
Okay, let me just clarify if I confuse things. I'm not suggesting that for economic reasons things are driven offshore. The bodies like the IETF, as well as research bodies, come up with interesting and valuable new ways of using the internet, refining its protocols, adding new protocols. If that has to face federal scrutiny, okay, it will be implemented offshore because in countries that don't control as tightly or don't control at all. And so you'll find users in those countries getting sort of at the bleeding edge of innovation. And this country is sort of sitting there saying, well, you know, eventually we'll do it, but we don't know whether, in fact, it will be approved by the FCC, so we better go through what could be a drawn-out process to get their agreement. And that will slow things down.
David,
to
can
a
I ask
massive
you
crawl.
a question? Do you believe that that is what is in the order now, or do you fear that that is the slippery slope on which we are if the current order is approved?
I fear the slippery slope.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, and it's not there now, but these hazy terms have a habit of generating slippery slopes.
We got a question here, John, back here in the center, this gentleman.
So I don't know how it's going to do it in practice. It doesn't have people.
Please identify yourself, give us your question.
Daniel Meredith, New America Foundation. I just had a question. What applications or managed services out there now would require prioritization as opposed to an increase in network traffic on the best effort network?
Richard, you want to take that?
Yeah, let me answer that question in reverse. One of the applications that requires less than best efforts is large file sharing, say, with BitTorrent. So rather than having a monthly cap that says, you know, you can only transmit up to X number of gigabytes per month on your account, what if your account had a feature where you could mark traffic as less than best effort and there was no cap on that? So that you would use this for doing your backups and for downloading movies and stuff that wasn't time critical. So you're sharing your preferences with your network operator. The network operator is able to enable you to run that application without having to pay for a level of service that application doesn't require. So on the negative side, that's one. On the positive side, high-definition video conferencing is something that if a lot of people are doing it at the same time, the networks don't currently have the capacity to support that over a standard internet connection. So there's kind of three major classes of applications we can talk about: things that require better than best efforts, things that require less than best efforts, and then, you know, the web stuff, which is in the middle.
David?
Yeah, just a comment there. Since most of these, quote, priorities will be set by applications, not people. And people are very bad at setting any priorities. They're bad at running their systems, period. If the carrier could tell you what its current load is, how crowded it is, applications could make much more intelligent responses to sending data. You know, if a file backup service doesn't have to say, here, take it, if it knows that it's bad time to send it.
Questions? All right, this gentleman right here, and then we'll get over here. We'll just come right around.
Sure. So, once again, it's Alex Howard from searchcompliance.com, and I'll do my best to ask a journalistic question this time. The GAO offered a report earlier this week, I believe, over concerns about congestion due from the H1N1 virus, and which is that, say, if there were 40% absenteeism, there would be unprecedented congestion on home networks. And the concern was that it actually might impact securities markets because workers at home wouldn't be able to telework effectively, amongst other issues. And they specifically looked at this as a national emergency case, and then looked to DHS potentially as the body, which would then deal with the issue. And the specific possibility might be then that individual users might have their bandwidth capped so that essential services or communications might get through. So,
question is, should they be in that position because Congress or the FCC hasn't moved to take authority to make those decisions itself? Who should have the ability to regulate this in this specific circumstance?
Certainly not DHS. I think there are lessons to be learned from 9/11, although obviously traffic has grown. The internet did not collapse. In fact, it's the only thing that kept New York connected to the rest of the world. Otherwise, we would have had real panic. So it's not clear that it's really going to, quote, overload the network. And I see no evidence to that fact. And saying that we're going to cut things off is apt to create more of a problem than it solves.
I would just like to add we should be very, very cautious of creating the sort of power that seems to be suggested here of one central decision maker deciding on what is prioritization and what is a critical use. There are some clear, very narrow exceptions that show up in public safety in the response to a crisis, for example. But to presume that certain sorts of economic activity are so important that they would be prioritized in the face of other activities is a tremendously complex question, which I would not want to see any official charged with handling.
Okay. We're running out of time. Just a couple more questions and brief answers. Yes, Judith, St. Ledger Roadie here. I know you.
Thank you. Dr. Bennett.
I know doctor. I'm just a rich.
I'm sorry. Well, you could be. As a lawyer, I've always presumed that the Communications Act actually allows discrimination under Title II. And with that presumption in mind, I mean, we've discussed a number of things where we think the wireless carriers may need to discriminate. Are there other things that we haven't talked about here where their discrimination would be necessary and also might be reasonable discrimination under the FCC's statute?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what Title II permits or doesn't, but I know that in the Markey bill, there, and not just the current version, but the two previous versions as well, there's a specific provision that says, yeah, you can prioritize and deprioritize, but you can't charge money for it. So nobody can pay an ISP to get better than best effort delivery to their packets, and that's this whole kind of dirt roads, you know, fast lane, slow lane kind of thing, which is inconsistent with the design of the internet, as several people pointed out, because content delivery networks are fast lane. People pay money to get their content on a content delivery network and get that fast lane. And it's faster because it's shorter. And that's just the way the internet protocols are designed. So there certainly is a desire, because of the fear that, that phone companies will exercise their market power to charge unreasonably high prices or degrade, the delivery of people who don't pay a premium fee, that we shouldn't allow that at all. And I think probably what we should be looking at is making sure that we have the right kind of oversight for it, but it's a capability that makes a lot of sense. I mean, clearly in this, if the user is going to be able to mark a packet as better than best effort, he should be willing to pay. And if I'm willing to do that to use a service, I don't see why the service provider can't pay my ISP on my behalf to get me that level of service and kind of get their video conferencing system off the ground that way.
All right, Scott Cleland, you want to get the mic here. You have to get the mic.
Very simple question for Harold and Rob. What is the specific problem that the FCC and PRM is trying to solve?
All right. Rob, why don't you handle that one?
Let's see.
Simple answer, simple question, right?
So the NPRM is trying. I almost want to punt this, Harold. So get ready.
If Dick will let me answer,
all right,
go ahead.
Let Harold.
The specific problem that this was supposed to try to address is the matter of regulatory certainty. And addressing in a rural context how you balance the interests that we've been talking about, the consumer protection aspect, certainty for developers at the edge, certainty for network operators to know what practices will and will not be permitted. I think that, unfortunately, the NPRM, by proposing a network management standard that is both self-referential, reasonable network practices are that which is reasonable, and has unfortunately created a potential that we will not resolve this adequately. And I share Dave's concern for these vague terms that have been put in the actual rulemaking definition.
All right. Final question right here, sir. This is the final. Did you have a question? Here, wait, take the mic.
Just a quick comment on the GAO report. You know, if the thesis is that if 40% of the workforce staying home can bring down the internet, what happens at 5 p.m. when 100% of the workforce comes home? And 100% of the workforce, and children come home from school. And so I think this is one issue that everybody on the panel agrees with, that government regulators should have no business in determining which websites get shut down. I mean, part of the recommendation that they said was that we need to shut down all the gaming sites, but gaming is a very low bit rate application, sub 0.1 megabits.
Well, they should learn how to do arithmetic before they want to step into that.
So this is one of those issues
We cut
that
Rob off before
everybody agrees.
Harold took over, so Rob, you got the chance to answer this one.
Well, yeah, I actually, George is making a point, and I want to chime in with my agreement to that. All of us probably have experienced the fact that we subscribe to, say, a 16 megabit per second service, and we get on the thing at 8:30 at night, and the best we can do is 3 or 4 megabits per second. And that's because it's a congested network, and that, say, some 30 or 40% of our neighborhood is also on the network at the same time. So we've seen this, and, you know, it doesn't work as well as we would like it to, but it still works. And the need to shut off some websites or shut off a certain class of customers so that a class of customer who carries a special card will be able to get their full speed seems insane to me.
Final word, David?
I just couldn't resist. You know, the telephone network has had for years line road control, which lets them cut off classes of users in, quote, critical times. I think the only time that was ever activated in New York, maybe 9/11, was when Brooklyn won the World Series and collapsed. But it's just, the telephone systems are designed to sort of meter people in. The network is designed to meter people in, and it's a lot better to have 10 bits per second than no bits per second.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panel, if you will. John Henke, do you have any final words for us?
Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody. I deeply, deeply appreciate everybody coming.
Thank you all. We're adjourned.